All right, let's dive into a really fascinating story drawn from our source material today. It's all about the birth, the decay, and the strange legacy of classical liberalism. Now, the argument we're going to unpack is that ideas we often see as kind of niche today were once this incredibly powerful, world-changing, revolutionary force. So how in the world did a movement like that end up on the sidelines? Let's get into it.
So let me start with a question for you. When you hear the words extreme left, who pops into your head? Well, according to the text we're looking at, the answer is probably not who you think. For a pretty long time in history, the most radical, forward-thinking party of change, it wasn't socialist, it wasn't communist, it was something else entirely. And to find that answer, we've got to go way back to the 17th and 18th centuries. This was the age of what's called the Old Order. Think absolute monarchies, rigid social hierarchies, and economies totally controlled by the state. And rising up to challenge all of that was a genuinely revolutionary movement, classical liberalism. And wow, the contrast here is pretty stark, right? On one side, you've got the old order, which was all about top-down controls, special privileges, and just immense state power. And on the other side, you have classical liberalism, which our source says was all about individual liberty, free markets, and a government that was so tiny you'd barely even notice it was there. I mean, the core idea was just so radical for its time. The goal was to separate the state from pretty much everything: the economy, church, your personal life, you name it. The whole point was to free up human creativity and ambition from the heavy hand of government control. And this wasn't just some dry economic theory, It was a deep moral conviction. Writings that were super popular at the time, like Cato's letters, really drove home this profound distrust of power. They basically framed all of human history as this constant struggle between an ever-growing state and an always-in-danger liberty. Which brings us to the source's big claim about the American Revolution. The argument here is that this was way more than just a fight over taxes. It was the world's first truly libertarian revolution. It was the peak of this radical thinking, creating a government with limits on its own power that were completely unheard of at the time. Okay, so if classical liberalism was this world-shaking revolutionary force that toppled the old ways and kicked off this new era of freedom and wealth, what on earth happened to it? Well, the text argues that after all those big wins, the movement started to lose its edge, and not because of some powerful enemy, but because it started to rot from the inside. And here's the first major problem. The revolutionaries, they got comfortable. Instead of continuing to push for the total separation of state and society, they kind of settled for defending the wins they already had. They went from being the party of radical change to, essentially, a conservative party. And that left a huge opening for other ideologies to swoop in and claim to be the new voice of progress. But why? Why did that happen? Well, our source digs into it and says there was this critical philosophical decay that really changed the soul of the movement, and it basically happened in two main steps. First, liberals started to ditch the whole idea of natural rights and picked up utilitarianism instead. So instead of arguing that liberty is a fundamental moral right, they started arguing that it was just the most useful way to get to the common good. It seems like a small change, but it meant that suddenly principles were up for negotiation. If you could justify a little bit of state power for the greater good here, well, why not over there too? And second, they got really into social Darwinism. Now, the text argues they totally misapply this idea. They looked at the slow, gradual process of biological evolution and thought, hey, society must work the same way. This led them to believe that big radical change was just unnatural. The best anyone could do was just wait for tiny little improvements over thousands of years. The revolutionary fire was completely gone. And man, what a contrast that was to the early spirit of the movement. Just think about a giant of the cause like the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. He knew ending slavery might take time, but he never, ever stopped shouting that it ought to happen right now, because slavery was a profound moral evil. This new gradualism, it had lost all of that moral urgency. So as classical liberalism got weaker and kind of lazy, the source describes how it was totally outmaneuvered. Two powerful new ideologies popped up to fill the void that it had left behind. First up was this new, much smarter version of conservatism. Instead of just being against progress, leaders like Bismarck in Germany pretended to be all for it. They used all this pro-business, pro-welfare language to justify a huge expansion of state power. We're talking war, regulations, protectionism. It was basically the old order in a new suit. And then came socialism. The source calls socialism a kind of confused hybrid ideology. The idea here is that socialism took the goals of liberalism, things like peace, freedom, prosperity, but then tried to achieve them using the tools of conservatism, a massive, all-powerful state, collectivism, and rule by a small elite. And this, right here, was the final blow. The socialists completely stole the title of the left, the party of hope, of progress, of radical change. And the once revolutionary liberals, they were suddenly stuck in this weird middle ground, being painted as boring defenders of the status quo, the very thing they were created to destroy. So let's wrap all this up by looking at the place where these ideas had their deepest roots, the United States. How did this story of decay actually play out there? And, what does that leave us with? According to our source, the Democratic Party was originally the Libertarian Party in America. But the issue of slavery completely tore it apart, and by the end of the 1800s, that libertarian wing was pretty much gone. Its last stand was this group of old-school liberals who formed the Anti-Imperialist League to fight against America's growing empire. It was one last battle against big government and war. So the source really points to two big reasons for this long, slow decay. First, abandoning natural rights in favor of utilitarianism, and second, embracing that passive, social Darwinist view of the world. And for a long, long time, it really seemed like that was the end of the story. The movement was dead and buried. But it wasn't. Because after laying out this whole story of a dramatic rise and a slow, painful fall, the text ends with a puzzle. It points out that, against all odds, the idea didn't actually die. It had a surprise comeback in the 20th century. Which leads us to one final, really provocative question. And that's where the source leaves us. Think about it. If an idea that was all about radical change somehow became seen as the boring old status quo and just faded into obscurity, what on earth could possibly happen to bring it back from the dead? It's a question that really sets the stage for understanding where these ideas are today. Thanks for joining me for this breakdown.